Greetings to all of you who have joined us today for our 6th MCC webinar, Advocacy for Peace and Justice, Conversations from the Field. We think of these as behind-the-scenes looks at MCC's work, and there are many of you joining from Zoom, and there are people joining us Facebook Live from multiple countries. So greetings and a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for your ongoing support for MCC, your interest in our work. We're thrilled that you are part of the MCC story, and we're really honored that we can offer you this unique view or glimpse into the way that we serve at MCC in the name of Christ. My name is Rick Kober-Bauman, and I serve as MCC Canada's Executive Director. Often I'm in Winnipeg, but in these days and today, I am coming to you from my home, which is just outside the little hamlet of Shakespeare in Southern Ontario. So you've been seeing some logistics and instructions on the screen while we're gathering. In case you've come on just in the last moment, I'll run over a few of those. You will be muted if you're on Zoom throughout the webinar. If you want to ask a question, please, we encourage that. Via Zoom, do it through the question and answer function, and you can find that in that black bar at the bottom of your screen when you wiggle your mouse around down there. And if you've joined via Facebook, you're encouraged to submit questions through the Facebook comments section. And we have a colleague monitoring those and sending them on. And you can submit those questions at any time. We won't necessarily answer them throughout. Probably won't interrupt the presenters, but we'll try to pick those up at the end. Not all the questions will necessarily be answered, but we'll try our best. And we are recording, so we want you to know that and that this will be made public after the live presentation. Now, by way of introduction today, some of you will know the old adage, maybe it's become a cliche, and it's very male-centric. The way I heard it at least was give a man a fish and he'll eat today, teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. And that was sometimes used in international development circles. And I remember when our family lived in Labrador in an Innu community, indigenous community, now many years ago, several decades ago, the people there with whom we lived, Innu people, were excellent fisher women and fishermen. They certainly didn't need anyone, certainly not me, to teach them anything about fishing. But there were some lakes that they no longer had access to. In one particular case, there was a lake called Mennonite, and it was inside a restricted bombing range that was used by 3 NATO air forces that were flying military test flights out of the local Canadian Forces base in Goose Bay. Our role as MCC service workers there was quite varied, but a large part of it was to help tell the story, both in Canada and in the countries where those air forces were based in Europe, to tell them about an indigenous people, to help amplify that story from the Innu people, that Innu wanted to retain access to their lakes rather than being stopped by military no trespassing signs. So those years really solidified my understanding of why it is and sometimes how it is that we do Jesus-grounded, faith-based advocacy work in MCC. And I'm glad to report that none of those air forces are still flying over Innu land today, though, of course, I don't think MCC can take all the credit for that change. So through our advocacy work, MCC tries to amplify, as I said, the voices of our global partners. Our vision is to bring about change in local communities or in the conditions that are facing the communities where MCC is working. So today we're going to hear stories of how advocacy makes a difference in the lives of marginalized and displaced people from Latin America to Palestine and Israel. MCC Canada has recently made some changes in order to increase our capacity for advocacy. We've expanded our main advocacy work through the Ottawa office, and they are based across the country, not just in Ottawa, to help us to speak well and effectively to the Canadian government and to advocate for peace and justice. So our presenters are each going to speak for about 7, maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll have the remainder of our hour for questions, conversation, and feedback. So who do you get to hear from today amongst our esteemed MCC colleagues? I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll be presenting. And first is Anna Vogt. Anna is the director of the MCC Ottawa office that I spoke of earlier. She grew up in Yukon, Dawson City to be precise. She previously served with MCC in Colombia, first as a participant in what we call our SEED program, and then in communications and advocacy. And today I believe she's working from her home in Ottawa. That's Anna Vogt. Anna Lee Giesbrecht is from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and is the MCC Advocacy and Communications Coordinator for Latin America and the Caribbean with Mennonite Central Committee. She studied at Canadian Mennonite University and Red River College, both of those are in Manitoba, and started her communications and advocacy work with MCC in Haiti before moving to her current role. And she is working from her home as well, which is in Mexico City. And our third presenters are a couple, James and Joan Alty, and they are from Howden, Manitoba. 3 adult children. They had served recently in Southern Africa as our MCC representatives, as well as area directors, and now are in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, as the MCC representatives for Palestine and Israel. And I say now that that is their role. James is actually coming to us from Jerusalem, and Joan is in a cabin in southern Manitoba in a tiny village, I think called New Bergtal. And if I got that right, Joan, you'll have to correct me. So we're really glad for all of you as presenters, glad for all of you who are participants today. And with that, I'd like to invite Anna Vogt to start us off. Anna, please.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with all of you today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy days to come and hear a little bit more about MCC and how we engage in advocacy and what that means for the work that we do. I'm just going to take a moment and share my screen with you. Just let me get that set up. There we go. And I'd like to start by just telling you what a mentor once told me before I'd actually started with MCC. He told me that advocacy, and I was just starting to think about advocacy as a possible career, and he said advocacy means to listen boldly. And that's been something that I've taken with me as I've walked with MCC partners over the years. And when I look back in MCC's history, we're celebrating our centennial this year, 100 years of working with displaced people. I can also see that bold listening as part of MCC's work. You can see here an early picture from 1923 of a refugee train with a family of Mennonites leaving Russia, trying to find refuge in Canada. And so that work with displaced peoples has been an early part of MCC. But I also think about that through conversations with authorities in what is now Ukraine, the newly formed MCC, Mennonite Central Committee, was told that they needed to provide food in the relief kitchens, not just for Mennonites, but for other vulnerable peoples. And while the early leaders of MCC fully agreed with that decision, it was through that contact, through speaking to authorities, that MCC was allowed access. And then it was that relationship and contact that started to actually form MCC into the organization that it is today, a body that responds to the needs of the most vulnerable, not only those who share our background, our faith, but that we engage in this work because of our faith, through our beliefs in peace, and in working for right relationships. And so as time went on in MCC's history, MCC saw the value of permanent offices to engage in advocacy or keep doing that bold listening in sites of government. You can see here behind Parliament, the Parliamentary Library in my town of Ottawa. And so MCC, in order to support our work with local communities, we thought it was important to engage with policies and structures that impact the communities where MCC works through our advocacy. There are currently offices in Ottawa, in Washington, and in New York. And MCC works to also support partners as they seek change as well through advocacy towards their own local government. To me, also reflecting on Rick's comments, advocacy can be a way of thinking about sustainability. of ensuring that we're addressing the policies that impact the communities that come from our governments, along with our day-to-day work of meeting urgent needs. But it's also really deeply about relationships. And here are some of the Ottawa office staff this winter, not everyone who's in our office, but a glimpse of winter in Ottawa. And then just thinking about staff and the ability to work and the participants on this screen, one story that always comes to mind when I think about relationships, when I think about advocacy, is actually an invitation that our office received just about 1 month after I had started working in the Ottawa office, to testify before the House of Commons Standing Committee on Migration and Refugees, to actually speak about root causes of forced displacement and what Canada could do to address some of those causes that have currently resulted in almost 80 million displaced people. And you can see here an infographic that looks at what some of those causes are. And I'm going to be honest, I was terrified. I was excited, but I could also feel my heart racing as I thought about sitting across from a row of tables with high-powered government officials ready to question and to grill. I had to take a deep breath and many more deep breaths over the next few days to center myself, to remember who I was representing. It was a moment again to think about listening boldly, that it wasn't even just about MCC in Ottawa, but the hundreds of organizations, communities, churches that MCC is honored to partner with around the world. This was a chance to bring some analysis, some recommendations around forced displacement based on MCC's relationships with folks like James and Joan, like Anna Lee, like others like them working around the world, and bring that relationship directly to parliamentarians, exactly what I was hired to do. And I'll be honest, my heart was still racing. And yeah, there were some hard questions that were asked, but I had prepared carefully, connected with our relationships, and was ready to share examples and experiences from our international work about the need for the Canadian government to support peace building and ensure that our trade policies aren't undermining our peace work. What I wasn't expecting in that moment was the enthusiastic greeting that I received from members of parliament from across all political parties, all committed to working on migration from different perspectives, from different viewpoints, but committed to doing the work. Entering that room was a chance to get a glimpse of the behind the scenes work of governing. Not everyone agrees with each other. I'm sure not all of us agree with each other in many parts of Canada or the world. But the room was full of people from different parties committed to doing the hard work of figuring out policy and studying issues. In the chit chat after the committee meeting, shaking hands with MPs, and hearing them mention MCC's good work about refugee sponsorship in their riding, I was again reminded of relationship. That MCC's testimony in that day might not have changed a policy in that moment, but it was a way of fostering and building a relationship, of connecting partners, international programs, displaced people with decision makers. It was the bold listening. And it's through these relationships between communities and decision makers isn't something that just happens in Ottawa. And you can see here a group of students actually from across Canada coming to Ottawa to learn more about the work of advocacy. And how they could foster relationships in their own communities. And that idea of relationship building is why we provide tools and ideas for churches and individuals across Canada to support this part of MCC's work by engaging with their own elected officials. We hear from MPs, from elected representatives in Washington, that they want to hear from people in their constituency, and that those conversations and voices matter, especially coming from a faith perspective. So part of our job is to provide those tools to facilitate relationships based on our 100-year history of advocacy, of relationship building, and deep connection with communities and relationship building. But I don't want to take any more time, actually. I want you to be able to hear more from some of my colleagues who engage in that day-to-day work of connecting with partners and communities, again, as part of MCC's advocacy work.
Wow, Anna, thank you. Excellent grounding and giving us the fundamentals here before we go further. I really liked that because I believe too that MCC is at its best when it takes relationships very seriously, but I'm not sure everyone thinks that way when we think about our advocacy work. So I appreciated you reminding us that even there, maybe even especially there, we'll have to see about that, that relationships are core. And I also really appreciated that you reminded us of the role that our churches play in that, and that part of our work is connecting them and their passions and their voices into the policy-making places that MCC is committed to working. Very good. Thank you, Anna. And now we're going to invite Annalie Giesbrecht, Mexico City. Please.
Thanks so much, Rick and Anna, for the introduction and for those inspiring words. I'm just going to start sharing my screen here as well. So thank you again for being here and taking the time out of your day to learn about how our partners and our offices, our advocacy offices, integrate advocacy into the rest of the work that they do. I'm going to talk a little bit about how a couple of our partners in Mexico and Guatemala use advocacy as, you know, part of a whole picture of the work that they do with vulnerable and migrant communities, addressing both root causes of migration and people's safety and dignity as they're on their migration journey. So I'm going to start out first in Guatemala with a partner called Pastoral de la Tierra, which is sort of the social ministry of the Catholic Church in that region. If you see where I've dropped the pin on the map there, you can see San Marcos is very close to the border with Mexico. And in a lot of the communities, especially the ones that I'm sort of going to be addressing here, they're located in the highlands of Guatemala, and most of them are Maya indigenous communities living in the highlands. This picture I took in the background, I think, is about 10,000 feet above sea level. So they're very rural, very remote communities, not close to any of the big cities. And migration is a really strong reality in these communities. I've got some facts about migration in the Department of San Marcos on the screen here. And what I want to highlight is how a variety of different factors come together when people are making the decision to migrate or to not migrate. So what we see in San Marcos is, you know, a variety of economic reasons that influence the reason people move. So that can be things like limited opportunities for youth in these remote communities, leading to seasonal migration during the coffee harvest. Climate change also plays a really strong role in migration in San Marcos. Changing weather patterns mean that harvests that were once reliable are increasingly unreliable. And another sort of strong factor that influences both of these things is the presence of a nearby mine, a Canadian-owned gold mine that has in the past has both taken up land that would have been used by you know, these local people, and has also damaged land through the processes of processing the raw materials. So the partner that we work with in this area, Pastoral de la Tierra, what they do is they you know, provide training and accompaniment on sustainable agroecology practices so that people have the opportunity and the technical skills to make the most out of the land that they have, and to do it in a way that's both sustainable and is based in the indigenous identity of the communities here. And they accompany that sort of technical training and technical work with human rights education and community organizing that gives people another set of technical skills that allows them to communicate with local authorities. And an example of this is, you know, local authorities in this area had been kind of in the habit of handing out chemical fertilizers. And the idea with these chemical fertilizers is not to like make the food that people are growing for their own families more productive, but to, you know, increase the productivity of cash crops that are grown in the region, which means that, you know, if you're growing cash crops for export, you're growing less food for your own family, and you're pretty dependent on the income that you're getting from these cash crops, which is because of climate change, you know, you're seeing increasingly unreliable income. And so people were sort of forced to rely on outside food. And, you know, there are nutritional implications and other implications of that as well. So what Pastoral de la Tierra does in this kind of situation is helps organize the communities in a way that is integrating, you know, the whole community, is bringing women in, is bringing youth in, and training them and giving those skills so that they can go to the municipal authorities and say, you know, isn't there a way that we can take the money that we're putting into this chemical fertilizer and you know, put it towards something that's more sustainable and that's going to, you know, actually increase people's ability to make their own living off the land, and give them the opportunity to choose migration as one of several options. So they're not sort of forced into migration as the only way to make a living for their family. Another way that Pastoral de la Tierra has participated in advocacy is through international spaces. So I mentioned the mine earlier, and some of the effects that it's had on the soil and the environment and the communities in the region. So in the past, MCC has been involved in campaigns around Canadian corporate responsibility abroad. And we've been able to use information from Pastoral de la Tierra and other partners that are influenced by Canadian mining practices and say, you know, this is what we're seeing in Guatemala, for example. This is how communities are being affected by the practices of Canadian mining companies. And these are the policies that they're asking for. This is what they're asking for so that they're not being affected in this way by Canadian companies. And then for the next partner, we're actually not traveling that far. If you see where the pin is dropped on the map there, it's just across the border from San Marcos in Guatemala in the state of Chiapas in Mexico. So Chiapas is the southernmost state in Mexico. It shares a border with Guatemala. It is one of the states with the fewest sort of, you know, money resources in Mexico, but it's also very rich in natural resources. It's one of the states with the highest indigenous population, and it has, you know, a fascinating history of advocacy and resistance. Because of their geographic location sharing the border with Guatemala, it means that migration is a very strong reality here as well, because when people are coming from Central America and making their way to Mexico or to the United States, when they cross the border into Mexico, Chiapas is the first state that they're in. And there's also a strong reality of internal migration as well, because sort of similar to San Marcos and Guatemala, you have these remote communities that are high up in the mountains that, you know, maybe lack opportunities for young people or, you know, are being affected by climate change in a similar way. And so a lot of people from Chiapas will migrate seasonally throughout Mexico and into the United States. In Chiapas, we work with a partner called Voces Mesoamericanas. And the project that we fund with them is a project monitoring migrant detention centers. So these are the places where, you know, if you cross the border into Mexico irregularly and you're detained, you're brought to these migrant detention centers. So Voces accompanies migrants in these centers through legal processes and connects them to, you know, some of the things that they need. They also monitor the conditions in the centers and carry out training sort of similar to what Pastoral de la Tierra does in the nearby indigenous communities. So those are trainings on human rights, you know, sustainable agroecological practice, a lot of those similar things addressing the root causes of why people migrate. As I was preparing for this webinar, I called some of the staff in Voces to kind of ask about what their work looks like on a kind of day-to-day basis. And they told me a story that I think illustrates, you know, what that work looks like in a very practical sense. So what they do is they come into the migrant detention centers to interview the people that are being detained there. And the story they told me was that they were interviewing a young woman and an older woman that had been traveling together from Central America. They had been fleeing violence, gang violence, domestic violence in their home country. And so, you know, they were kind of making their way up that route from Central America to the United States. And they were brought over the border between Mexico and Guatemala by a coyote. So these are the people that bring migrants from Central America, from Mexico up to the US. And, you know, it's a big business, it's very expensive. And the idea was that they would be brought over the border into Mexico and later the next day brought to the United States. But instead, they were kidnapped by people that the coyote was working with. And they, you know, their families were extorted. Their families ended up paying about $4,000 US, which is, you know, it's a lot of money. And instead of sort of continuing on the road to the United States, after the Coyotes had extorted this money from their families, they just kind of dropped them off on the side of the road in Chiapas. And they were eventually picked up by a vehicle from the migration authorities and brought to the detention center in San Cristobal de las Casas. And probably would have been deported if they hadn't encountered the team from Voces that was interviewing people in the detention center. And so what the team from Voces was able to do was to say, you know, you have, these are your rights, and you're right, you have the right because of what you've been through to apply for asylum in Mexico. And we're going to start you off on that long, complicated process of seeking legal asylum. And they were also able to say, you've been the victim of a crime in Mexico, and it's also your right to report that. And we'll start that process of making that report and denouncing the violence that you've suffered. They were also able to connect these women with medical care, with psychosocial care, and eventually get them out of the migrant detention center and into a women's shelter in San Cristobal de las Casas. So what they do is, you know, they bring this information, this sort of complicated legal information about how to migrate regularly and how to start these processes to the people in the migrant detention centers. And at the same time, what they're doing is they're seeing the conditions in the migrant center. So they were able to say in this case, you know, these women haven't received medical care that they need after this experience. They haven't received psychological care that they need after the trauma that they've experienced. And they're able to sort of, you know, in addition to connecting the individuals to those services, they're able to see the big picture to say, you know, migrants aren't getting access to the services that they need, and to compile that information and eventually bring it to the relevant authorities. So that's just like a quick overview of some of the work that two of our partners do. There's a lot more we could say, but I'm gonna give it over back to Rick and then to James and Joan.
Thank you, Annalee. I would say that in Canada, and I think even more in the US, that trail of movements from Latin America into the southern US through Mexico is a constant story. It gets bumped aside from time to time, but seldom do we get that close as you took us, to impacts on real people, and then interventions that, in the cases of those two partners, that MCC is able to be part of. So thank you for taking us up close and personal there. And yes, now we want to hear from James and Joan from their various places in southern Manitoba and East Jerusalem. Please.
Thanks, Rick. I have the first part, so I will start. James and I had been MCC representatives in Palestine and Israel for 5 months when we took our first trip to Gaza. I'd like to tell you about one of MCC's partners there. It's the Culture and Free Thought Association, or CFTA for short, that manages 5 community centers. 2 serve children, 6 to 12 years. 1 is for teenagers, 1 is a women's center, and 1 is a health center. But we visited the children's center, and they were simply marvelous. They would have been wonderful anywhere, but its location in the Gaza Strip made its existence and the services that it provided exceptional. At the center, we also met one of the 5 founders, Majda Al-Sakwa, the current Vice General Director. She is one of those women that when you meet them, you know they make things happen. She radiates energy and life. But her own life actually hasn't always been that easy, because when she was sharing with our MCC advocacy offices over Zoom last July, the first thing she shared was her age. She said, I am 50 years old, and in those 50 years, I have never been free. I'll tell you a little bit more about this partner and the founder, but first James is going to give you some context to Gaza.
Thanks, Joan. So in terms of the context, I want to just give you a little bit of history about the Gaza Strip, and then a little bit of the geographical context for Gaza, and then Joan will lead us back into the experience with CFTA. When World War I ended, the Middle East was divided up by the League of Nations, with Palestine coming under the British mandate. And this mandate lasted from 1917 to 1948, with a goal to set up self-rule for the local population and then leave. This goal was somewhat complicated by Britain's support of Zionism, which is a political ideology that started in the late 1800s, holding the belief that Jewish people would never be safe from anti-Semitism they experienced almost everywhere in the world. And until they had their own nation, they would not be free of that fear of the anti-Semitic movements. So Palestine was selected as the land for the Jewish people, and the immigration started. And for the most part, Arabic-speaking people and Jews were able to live together peacefully, although with some notable exceptions during that time period. Then World War II came about, and the Holocaust, and the genocide of 6 million Jews, and the number of Jews who therefore needed sanctuary outside of Europe. And therefore, immigration started into Palestine, and the numbers started building. And with Britain supporting Zionism, the locals, mostly Arabic-speaking Muslims, but also Arabic-speaking Christians, became concerned with the increasing number of immigrants into this land. In 1948, the British mandate expired, and after it expired, the next day, the Jewish state of Israel was proclaimed as we know it today. The Israeli army between 1947 and 1945 expelled approximately 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, or they evacuated themselves to make way for the new Jewish immigrants coming into the land. And this became known amongst Arabic-speaking people as the Nakba, or catastrophe. And 70 plus years later, the occupation that started in 48, 49 carries on. So the Palestinians fled to neighboring countries such as the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, Lebanon, and the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip, or they were settled within the West Bank as internally displaced people. Israel occupied the Gaza Strip after the Six-Day War of 1967, but in 2005, the then Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, decided on a policy of disengagement from Gaza, forcing all Israeli citizens to leave and come back into the state of Israel. 2 years later, the control of the Gaza Strip turned over to Hamas, which was seen by many Western nations and still is seen by many Western nations as a terrorist group. So Israel responded to this perceived security threat, and they imposed a military closure around the Gaza Strip, controlling both the entry and the exit of people and supplies. And the resulting isolation of the Gaza Strip from the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory and the world at large has left it with severe economic, health, agricultural, and educational challenges. The Gaza Strip itself is actually a very small piece of territory. It's 41 kilometers long and between 4 and 12 kilometers wide, as you can see on the map. It amounts to about 360 square kilometers and has a population of over 2 million people. To contrast that with a Canadian city, Abbotsford, British Columbia would probably be very close in terms of land mass. It's about 15 square kilometers larger than Gaza. However, it only has a population of 142,000, or about 7% of Gaza's population. For those folks that might be watching from the USA, Washington, D.C. is about 2 times larger than Gaza, to give some perspective here. So it's no wonder that Gaza has been described as the largest open-air prison in the world. In 2012, the UN said Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. Well, here we are. It's now 2020, and there's a worldwide pandemic on the doorstep of Gaza Strip and walking through the door. It's a world of contrasts. The roads are overcrowded. The infrastructure is collapsing. And there's a severe crisis in that very tiny piece of the land here in the Middle East. So I'm going to turn it over now to Joan, and she's going to take us through a visit with one of our partners in Gaza.
Joan, as you're coming in.
Thank you. And
sorry, Joan. I was just going to remind listeners that they can be thinking of questions, both as you and James are speaking, but also reflecting on comments that they heard from Anna and Anna Lee earlier. Sorry for the interruption, Joan. Please go ahead.
No problem. And we'll move on to the next slide. We visited one of, actually we visited all three of MCC's partners on our trip there, but the one I'm telling you about is CFTA. The center was started in 1991 in yet another period of violence and conflict between Israeli armed forces and Palestinians. For the average child in Gaza, life was and life is full of violence and fear and trauma. So this group of 5 moms started a center that children go to when they're not in school. School is only half days in Gaza due to insufficient school buildings, so there's time. Their idea was to give their kids and other kids a place that's life-giving and safe. The center focuses on developing self-esteem and decision-making in children through activities. And what amazing activities. We can see the next 2 slides as I speak. We saw the children learning Dutchka dance, a cultural dance in a large performance room. We looked through the books that children wrote and illustrated. We visited the science room where children build small robotics. We marveled at the art displays. And we watched a social worker working with a group of children who were having trouble dealing with trauma in their lives. We can see those next slides, if we can, which just show the activities of the center. The center is just full of colorful, fun places. And James could barely get me out of the center at the end of our visit. I was enjoying it so much. So what can advocacy do about this situation in Palestine, but especially in Gaza? Advocacy can encourage our government to use its voice to help end the Israeli occupation of Palestine, so children don't go to bed in the largest open area prison in the world. As I mentioned, Mazda joined one of our meetings with the MCC advocacy offices, and she ended her presentation explaining that when she knows there are people on the outside who care and are willing to share her concerns with decision makers, it gives her hope. So let me end by reflecting on the words of the psalmist in Psalm 9:18. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever.
Thank you, Joan.
So back to you, Rick.
And thank you, James. Joan, can you just read that Psalm text again? If you want to just unmute, I'd just love for you to share that again, please.
So it's Psalm 9:18. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever.
Yeah, it comes from Psalms. Could have been Jesus. We think of ourselves as a Old Testament and a New Testament faith community at MCC, and as I'm giving people a little more time to think about responses to questions, James and Joan, while your words are fresh with us, I'd love to hear you reflect a little more on, you've spoken very specifically about Gaza as a particular part of Palestine, Israel, but for many of us on this call, we've heard the area that you walk around and travel around as described as the Holy Land, and we also know it's the place of the Jesus stories, the Jesus miracles, the Jesus teachings. How does our rootedness in the gospel of peace, the Jesus gospel of peace, how does that shape the tough kinds of work, the advocacy work there? Not that it doesn't elsewhere, but I think I'm inviting you as the people who are there in Palestine, Israel. How would you make those links for us there?
I think Anna started off well with the words of our mentor, her mentor, by saying, listening boldly. I think throughout Scripture, right from Genesis, where chaos listened to God's voice, and out of the chaos was formed cosmos. And then in Deuteronomy 6:4, the great Shema that all faithful Jews recite 3 times a day. And it starts off with the word, listen, O Israel. And then the action of love follows. And then we see that again with the disciples. They first listen to Jesus, then they follow and love. And then, the Apostle Paul in Romans asks us to listen to these 3 deep groans. And that first groan is the groan of the world. And out of listening that groan, we love and we follow Christ in responding the way that we believe he would want us to respond to.
Thank you. And thanks for tying us back to, Old and New Testament, but also to Anna's comments about our work being rooted in listening well to the communities where MCC has placed you. Well, I sort of want to open it up to Anna Lee, to that most recent question I asked of James and Joan. Feel free to weigh in, or Joan as well. And I've got a few questions that have come to me, and I'll get one of those ready. And while we see if the rest of you want to speak to that first one.
I think maybe for me, when I think about that question too, not just the Holy Land, but I think of that invitation of churches to be Jesus' hands and feet. And I just feel like I've had this enormous privilege through many different experiences of working with MCC to see churches at work, and to see even churches in Palestine engaging. The communities that we work with in Latin America are through Mennonite World Conference, but just to really see how churches are already there and carrying out the Great Commission, or really sharing the gospel through actions of caring for one another. And that to me gives me an enormous sense of hope, especially in the role of faith communities in that relationship building, that bold listening, that advocacy can be part of the way that we live out our calling.
And I think as well, Anna and Rick, the Christians of Palestine who have been here for centuries are also inviting us to listen to them as well. They see North Americans coming on pilgrimages to see the historic stones, but they're saying, wait a minute, we're the living stones in the Holy Land. Don't just visit the historic stones. Visit us, talk to us, listen to our concerns and the things that are on our hearts as well. And so that's a very open invitation to us as Christians to respond to sisters and brothers in Christ in the Holy Land.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think it's easy to forget in the sort of dichotomized conflict there in Palestine, Israel, that this is not a place only of Muslim and Jewish communities, that there's an active, though small, Christian community that has a voice. And thanks for listening to it and now amplifying that today. Annalie, sorry, Joan, were you unmuting to get in there? I thought, Joan, you were coming in.
No, sorry, I am unmuted.
Okay, then I'm going to go to Annalie. Annalie, you talked a bit about climate change and that as a root cause for some of the forced movement of people. You talked about MCC's commitment to peace building as core to our work. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how those two pieces play into our advocacy work in your region in Latin America.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are both really strong realities throughout Latin America. And we are starting to think a lot about sort of the intersection of those two things, about peace building and about climate change. Because I think something that you see a lot throughout Latin America is that a lot of the conflicts and some of these like really old, really terrible conflicts come out of land and people's access to the land and people's ability to make a living from the land, and both, and so climate is a big part of that, right? Like I kind of talked a bit about with what Pastoral does. You know, they're dependent on the land to make a living. They're not close to big cities and the resources of big cities, and they're indigenous people. They have a really close and spiritual relationship to the land. And so obviously when that relationship is disrupted, be it by climate change, be it by extractive industry, that really often leads to conflict. And so we're sort of working on developing our understanding of how peace building and climate change and migration all interact in Latin America. And it can be really complex. You know, we don't necessarily see that people are on the move and they are just like, yep, we're moving because of climate change. That's the only reason. But, you know, we're trying to work together to analyze and sort of pull apart those threads of the various different reasons why people move, whether that's conflict, climate, or any combination of all of those things.
Right. Often not a single story, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
You know, here's a question that's come in from a couple of people. They're wondering about congregations. Anna Vogt, I'm going to give you a heads up and first go at this one. How can congregations, I'm sort of assuming this is a Canada question, but maybe not. How can they get involved? I think this is as congregations, not just as individuals within them.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I think one of the resources that we actually have developed is an advocacy toolkit, which is full of, and again, most of that information is, there's some Canadian specific information, but there's also ways of coming together as churches or congregations that I think can apply in both the US and Canada, but thinking of as communities of faith, what are some tools and information that we can provide to you that can help you come together to think deeply about these kind of things. I know there's churches as well who have engaged with our Peace Sunday packet, which is an annual resource that we provide with worship materials and reflections that connect with MCC's work. The Peace Packet this year is actually about being people of hospitality and of refuge that connects really well with the themes of forced displacement. And so that's, I think, for congregations to engage in worship and reflection together as a group is actually a really powerful role that churches can play to worship together, to remember some of that theology that we shared that James was mentioning. So small group Bible studies about issues connected to justice, making commitments together to hold each other accountable about setting up phone calls with elected representatives, or meeting with MCC staff in the provinces for more information. Could be really great next steps.
Well, Anna, thank you. I mean, a couple of things happened there. One is, this isn't just about MCC Canada staff and partners in this back and forth relationship of advocacy. There's this invitation to the church, what I think you often call public engagement or community engagement, where you're inviting other people who have a passion for this, who are informed or want to be more informed. And then there's a provision of some tools, some resources. So I'm going to name an additional one. You heard Anna talk about the Peace Packet. And I know just as I mentioned it, our dear friend Rachel is posting that for you in the chat. So please look for that link. And there is also something I'm going to reference back to James and Joan in Palestine, Israel, something called Cry for Home, which has been a multi-year campaign of MCC Canada. And that is looking at, as the name suggests, how will all people who call and want to call Palestine, Israel their home, truly have a home that is safe and dignified and is a place of security and home the way we think of home. So thanks, Rachel, for putting those resources up. As a reminder, we are creating and sharing resources and then inviting people to be involved in this public engagement and advocacy work as well. Thanks for that, Anna. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to another question that's kind of coming back to you as individuals, how you find this. Anna Lee, I think I'm going to go to you first. The question is, what do you find are the biggest challenges to speaking the truth in love in your advocacy work? Certainly welcome others of our panel to weigh in, but Annalie, I'm going to pick on you first.
Sure. Well, there are always a lot of challenges. I think that, well, let me talk about two. I mean, when I think about our partners here in Latin America, you know, civic engagement can be something that's really difficult when you are dealing with governments, whether that's at the municipal level or at the national level, that just, quite frankly, aren't interested in hearing what you have to say. And there can be very, you know, powerful other forces that are involved in, you know, all levels of government that can actually make that work quite dangerous for a lot of people. Or, and even if it doesn't make it dangerous, you know, it can discourage people who might have a lot of things to say from sort of taking on that burden. And I think another challenge that, and this is kind of worldwide too, is that, you know, there are times when governments are open to hearing certain things, and other times when it just, you know, despite the very real needs that communities might have, when you think about the other side of the conversation, there's just not an opening for that conversation. And that can be a real challenge, you know, that kind of strategic, practical thinking. I think for both people who are working directly with communities and for people in our advocacy offices in Canada and the United States.
Thanks, Annalie. Appreciate your insights there. Anyone else want to speak to the what do you find are the biggest challenges to speaking the truth in love in your advocacy work?
I think I could pick up on what Annalie was saying in terms of right now we get our visas from the Israeli government, and to give them credit, they're allowing in organizations who look at both sides of the Israeli-Palestine issue. But we are always aware that we are there at their generosity, and that we need to be using our advocacy offices to speak through our decision makers well, so that we can get the voices of our partners out there without them being put into any uncomfortable spots.
Right.
I would add to that as well, there's a famous TED talk called The Danger of the Single Story. And we're in a community where there's multiple stories about the same historic events. And so advocating really requires us, as I was talking about earlier, to listen and to listen well, because whoever holds that particular story has a lot of power in the way it's told. And so we have to tease out these different stories and bring people together, not be the wedge that divides people, but find ways to find those common points where we can start talking and then work our way sort of outwards to the more difficult conversations and bringing people together.
Yeah.
And it's a political, it will be seen as political by whoever you're talking to, if it's not the way they want conversation to go. And so, but we need to love all. And so listening and hearing the different stories, because notwithstanding what it's sometimes we see on the media, it is not a homogeneous population either in Israel or in the West Bank. There's a lot of different viewpoints, and there's some wonderful Israeli organizations doing advocacy in Israel for folks in the West Bank, for folks in Gaza. And in the same way, there are folks in the West Bank that love Israeli people. There's not a hatred there, but there is a desire to be recognized and have their dignity recognized, and to be at Edom with the people and the land.
Wow, there's all kinds of pieces we could pick up there. Go ahead, Joan.
I think one of the most effective advocacies is when there are organizations that bring Jewish Israelis and Palestinians together. And there's a number of situations where that happens, and they get to know the other, and that's what they really need. Because people just want to have a happy, normal life. They're not, most people are not terrorists. Most people don't want to, throw kids in prison. And So I think those bring people together.
Yeah, I appreciate all of you recognizing, and James, you said this a moment ago, that we will sometimes use the word political to brand a space that, and we get that at MCC sometimes as well. We ought not to be there. We're a relief organization, and we are more than that. And today we're talking about other elements, but I think I've appreciated hearing both the sort of gospel groundedness of our work and the readiness to accept complexity, to listen in highly complicated communities, and then be able to speak with authenticity and integrity alongside our partners. That is not a small task. So I'm going to start with some of my thank yous here, which will be a tip to all of you that we're getting close to the top of the hour. If you still want to get a question in, I would love to take one or two more. I also want to point out a resource, another one that's in the chat now. Thank you. This is the toolkit, the Advocacy Toolkit. So I spoke earlier about some more specific resources like the Peace Packet and the Cry for Home campaign materials. But just pulling back a little to the more general case of doing public engagement and advocacy work, that toolbox or toolkit is available as well. I'm not seeing new questions here. I think I'm going to continue with my thank yous. I'm going to start with our panelists in reverse order, James and Joan. Temporarily divided, but hopefully reunited soon. Thanks for your ongoing work in Palestine, Israel, including Gaza, which you reminded us of eloquently today. Thank you. Annalie, Mexico City and Latin America, thank you for the deep, they weren't glimpses, they were good gazes into partner work there and MCC's engagement with those partners. And Anna in Ottawa, thanks for starting us off and reminding us of our collective roots, and we appreciated your personal mentor story there as well. And of course, to all of you who've joined us. I don't even know how many you are. Yeah, I don't know who you are, where you are, and how many you are, but we're really grateful that you chose to spend this hour with us. I have a thank you to pass on from a particular Manitoban colleague of mine, Daryl Lowen. Hi, Daryl. MCC's Manitoba director is sending his thank yous and assuring all of you that Manitobans are remembering you. Daryl speaks for all Manitobans, apparently, that they're thinking of you and expressing their gratitude. Another colleague, Mark Tim. Hi, Mark. Thank you for your note to the rest of the group here. We're really glad to do these webinars, and I want to just give you a heads up of what is coming. We have a podcast that we like to plug when we're together with you. It's called Relief Development and Podcast. Wherever you listen to your podcast, you should be able to find this one. September's takes a deep dive into what community means and features a loaves and fishes story from an MCC partner in Colombia. An interview with Elaine Hofer, a Hutterite woman, and a story about the Dragon of Addis Ababa. So that ought to prompt your intrigue there, and hopefully you'll go look for Relief, Development, and Podcast for your listening in the next few days. And then about a month from now, on the 23rd of October, we'll gather again for our next webinar, Journey of a Kit. Those of you who are engaged a little bit with MCC's material resources will recognize that there are many kinds of kits that we put together and send into particular places where MCC has partners. Journey of a Kit, how relief supplies travel across the globe. When disaster strikes, our supporters provide much needed emergency supplies. Find out how the items you donate are sent across the globe. Hope you can be back. We are very grateful for your presence with us today, your ongoing prayers, and the many ways you contribute to Mennonite Central Committee, and really you're contributing to the needs of the world through MCC. Oh, there's some more comments coming in. I'm reminding you of Buckets of Thanks, which is coming up this fall, and more gratitude from I guess I'm not breaching anyone's privacy. Tim Craker, Joan Neufeld, thank you, Joan and Tim, for joining us, and I'm passing on your gratitude to our panelists. Very good to be with you. It's the top of the hour. We're grateful. Thanks be to God.